It's probably no secret to anyone who spends far too much time online that today anime has become, in many ways, more popular than ever. Thanks to streaming video making it much easier for people to gain access to shows as they're currently airing in Japan. Along with the internet just generally being able to connect millions of fans together from all across the world, anime truly has become a global sensation. And you know what that means? There's also a whole host of guys in business suits coming out of the woodwork to milk this fresh new cash cow for all it's worth. In a lot of ways, this is sort of just an unfortunate rite of passage for any medium that starts to exponentially grow in popularity. You know, just another one of those lovely little aspects to capitalism. But because pop culture does tend to have a certain ebb and flow to it, this also tends to have some awkward side effects to it as well. Let's, for example, take the world of cinema. Now, for the better part of the past decade, comic book movies have easily been the single most dominant force in all of entertainment. But it wasn't always like that. Before the MCU and Christopher Nolan's Dark Knight trilogy, adaptations of popular fantasy and young adult novels were all the rage, and studios were relentlessly trying to be the lucky ones to capitalize on the next Lord of the Rings, Harry Potter, Twilight, or The Hunger Games. I mean, seriously, you could not go to the movies in the mid-2000s without being subjected to, like, an adaptation of the 39th best-selling fantasy series that had at least 3 books already published in it. Like, how many of you all saw The Seeker, The Dark is Rising when it was showing in theaters? Because I sure did, and I don't remember a damned thing about that film. Wait, what was I talking about again? Oh, right, comic book movies. So what I'm really trying to say with all this is, if history has taught us anything, it's that superhero movies are going to start eventually waning in popularity. And you better believe that every studio has someone making a 6-figure salary to try and figure out what that next big trend is going to be, which may very well be anime. In fact, the medium has already gone through multiple test cycles of this in the past. At the end of the 2000s, around the same time that comic book movies were really starting to take off with smash hits like Iron Man and The Dark Knights, we got big studio adaptations of both Speed Racer and Dragon Ball. And just a few years ago, we had American remakes of Death Note and Battle Angel Alita. And aside from the medium that they all originated from, the one thing that all of these movies have in common is that in one way or another, all of them failed. Whether it was because the film was critically panned or just never managed to find an audience until it was almost a decade too late, none of these films were able to deliver on one of the primary reasons they were made. They weren't the next big thing. But here at Select Screen, we don't judge a film based on how effective it is at producing revenue for a bunch of already exceedingly rich studio heads. No, we judge a film based on things like artistry and craftsmanship and how easily I can make a video about it that's way too long. And so it's for that reason that I want to take a deep dive into a film that was a failure, both from a critical perspective and a financial one. An adaptation of a movie that was a foundational pillar for making anime popular in the West to begin with, and is in my mind a perfect microcosm of what goes wrong when anime goes Hollywood. That's right, today we're talking about the 2017 remake of Ghost in the Shell. Now, if we're going to take a closer look at why one version of the story has become so beloved, while the other has accrued next to no lasting cultural impact since its release, well, eventually we're just going to have to investigate what these two films have in common, and perhaps more importantly, what they don't. So I figured we might as well just get that out of the way up top. And what better place to start comparing and contrasting these two films than at, well, the beginning. So the first thing we see as the original 1995 Ghost in the Shell opens is some on-screen text saying, "In the not-so-distant future, when the corporate networks fill the Earth with electronic and optical communication lines, but society has not yet been too computerized to erase nations and races." And just as the passage trails off, we move directly into the opening scene, introducing our protagonist, Major Motoko Kusanagi, along with a few of her colleagues at Section 9, as they carry out a covert assassination mission. Next, we get the opening title sequence of our montage of the Major's android body being assembled, and now we're finally ready to start the film in earnest. Now, in essence, the opening to Ghost in the Shell 2017 appears to be a fairly faithful adaptation of the film that came before it, with the only real difference being the order of scenes and a conversation between two new characters that gets spliced in. But the changes that were made, for as small as they may seem when compared to the bigger picture, actually do go a long way towards helping us understand just how different these two films really are. For instance, as in the animated version, the live-action reboot also opens with a passage that reads, "In the future, the line between human and machine is disappearing. Advancements in technology allow humans to enhance themselves with cybernetic parts. Hanker Robotics, funded by the government, is developing a military operative that will blur the line even further. By transplanting a human brain into a fully synthetic body, they will combine the strongest attributes of human and robot." Which is an interesting change from the text in the anime. While the remake does boast a higher word count, it also strikes me as shallower, mostly due to its more constrained focus. But more on that in a second. After the opening text leaves the screen, we get a short new scene of a body being wheeled into what we assume is some sort of high-tech operating room, which then transitions into a similar opening credit sequence where we see the Major's body being constructed. After this, we get another brief new scene of the Major waking up for the first time in her new cybernetic body, seemingly with only limited memories of what has happened to her and in an obvious state of distress. The scene concludes with a private conversation between Dr. Olay, the creator of the Major's android body, and Hanker Robotics CEO Cutter, in which the film somewhat inelegantly sets up the themes for the rest of the movie. Following that, we get a title card telling us 1 year has passed, and finally we proceed to watch a slightly altered version of the opening mission from Ghost in the Shell 95. Now before we dig into that action scene, I want to spend a second talking about the new material that got added in.
A machine can't lead, it can only follow orders. A machine can't imagine or care or intuit, but as a human mind, in a cybernetic frame, Mira can do all those things and more.
The first of her kind. She will join Section 9 as soon as she is operational.
Please don't do that. You're reducing a complex human to a machine.
I don't think of her as a machine. She's a weapon.
Okay, so right off the bat, we understand that this guy is clearly an asshole, and probably going to be one of the primary villains in the film. But the scene also sets up a pretty clear dichotomy between machines and humans. At least in Dr. Olay's mind, machines are mindless tools that have no agency or souls of their own. But by combining a human mind with a cybernetic body, she has, as the opening passage states, combined the strongest attributes of humans and robots. To Olay, because the Major still has her human brain, because she can still think for herself, she believes she still has a soul. To use the terminology of the film, she still has a ghost in her shell. But Cutter, on the other hand, isn't really concerned with how human or not human the Major is at all. To him, she is nothing more than a weapon, because as the CEO of a cybernetics company that has a military contract with the government, that is what is the most beneficial for him. And all of this is, well, it's pretty well-trodden territory as far as sci-fi and cyberpunk goes. But again, we'll have plenty of time to expand on that particular complaint later on in the video. For now, let's finish off this section by taking a look at how these two films portray this opening action scene, starting with the remake. So a year after the Major joins Section 9, we find her standing on top of this skyscraper monitoring the building's internal network. After seeing 6 armed men enter the building, the Major quickly springs into action, despite the fact that her commanding officer specifically tells her not to. As the armed men from before break into a dining room where a doctor from Hanker Robotics is hosting a small dinner party, a rogue service bot who is being remotely controlled by some shadowy figure attempts to hack into the doctor's cyberbrain. Thankfully though, the Major heroically intervenes by stylishly dispatching the armed assailants and saving the doctor from the hacked Geisha bot. After the fighting is done, Bateau shows up with the rest of Section 9 and we get some more really subtle dialogue and acting.
You're not the same. Hey.
It's just a robot.
Yeah, I mean, it's just a robot. Anyways, now let's take a look at how that same scene plays out in the anime. Again, we're introduced to the Major perched on top of a skyscraper monitoring the building's surveillance network, but the meeting she's observing is quite different this time around. Instead of a fancy dinner, we see a secret meeting between a foreign diplomat for an unnamed nation and a programmer looking to seek asylum in the representative's country. As Section 6, another division within the government's Public Security Bureau, moves in to break up this meeting, the Major swiftly rappels off the rooftop and assassinates the diplomat before he can be arrested. In a short scene following the opening credits, it's confirmed that Section 9 was actually doing Section 6 a favor by killing the foreign official, because Section 6, as a public-facing branch of the government, only had jurisdiction to arrest the diplomat, which more than likely would have resulted in nothing more than the official being deported, which would have also allowed for the programmer he was meeting with to potentially flee the country as well. Okay, so I know that was all kind of a lot, so we're just going to start by breaking this down piece by piece. Now obviously, the biggest difference between these two scenes is the Major's actual objective. In one film, she's trying to save the Doctor from Hanker Robotics from being remotely hacked by a seemingly nefarious individual, and in the other, she's carrying out the extrajudicial killing of a foreign diplomat. To put it as simply as I can, in the live-action remake, she is trying to stop the bad guys, and in the anime, she's pretending to be a bad guy. Or I guess, depending on your perspective, not even really pretending. And furthermore, these two scenes set an interesting precedent for how sympathetic we're supposed to feel towards the Major overall. For instance, let's think about the order in which these two scenes appear in each movie again. In the anime, this action scene is literally the first thing we see after the opening text. This is our introduction to the Major as a character, killing someone who we have no idea if they deserved to die or not. Meanwhile, in the live-action remake, we start off by seeing her wheeled into an ominous-looking operating room, waking up from surgery in her new body terrified. We hear Cutter treating her like a tool instead of a person, and we see she is willing to directly disobey orders if it means protecting an innocent person. Essentially, in the Hollywood version, the Major is clearly our hero who we're meant to root for and invest ourselves into her character. But in the anime, she's presented as someone that we can't instantly get a clean moral read on, in essence, subverting any built-in bias we might feel towards her as the protagonist. Finally, let's wrap up this section by going back to that opening text from each film again. So what I meant by the live-action version using more words to ultimately say less has everything to do with these differing levels of depth. Although the remake certainly gestures at the wider societal implications of further integrating humanity with cybernetics by specifically naming Hanker Robotics and tying them directly to the government, the real focal point is on that final sentence. By transplanting a human brain into a fully synthetic body, they will combine the strongest attributes of human and robot. That, the line between man and machine, is ultimately what the film is going to be about, why the Major is our central character, and most importantly of all, why the film goes out of its way from the very beginning to portray her as an empathetic figure to us. Because she's going to be the prism through which the film wants to explore these core ideas. But in contrast, as the anime's opening text suggests, that film is going to be much more interested in not just the effects technology has had on the individual, but on society and culture as a whole. In other words, these two films are just operating on completely different levels. Alright, so now that we've thoroughly gone over how each of these films begins, let's take a look at where both of them go from there. Albeit, for the sake of both your time and mine, in much less detail. So when you really get down to it, Ghost in the Shell 2017 isn't so much a retelling of just the 1995 film, but instead more of an amalgamation of the entire franchise's greatest hits. While it does visually borrow most heavily from the first film, there's also plenty of imagery lifted from the film's direct sequel, Innocence, as well as the television series Standalone Complex and the OVA series Arise, in an attempt to spruce up some of the environments and character designs. But by far the most important element of the film that gets this mashup treatment is the story's initial villain, Kuze. Instead of being just a direct copy of the Puppet Master from the 95 film, Kuze is most directly comparable to the antagonist from the second season of Standalone Complex, even going so far as to share the same name. And on one hand, this actually seems like a smart adaptive choice by the writers, due to the fact that Kuze and the Puppet Master share enough traits that you could swap one out for the other without much trouble, but also with the added advantage that Kuze shares a personal history with the Major as well, which ties in nicely with the plot point about her lost memories and the film's more character-focused perspective. The problem is, though, if you're not careful about making changes like this, they can have some unintended consequences. With the first example being one of the original movie's most important characters, Togusa. Now, Togusa is an interesting character because in the animated version, he is someone who directly ties into one of the core themes the film is working with. And in the reboot, he basically just doesn't exist. Like, seriously, based on how little screen time he gets, I'd be shocked if anyone came out of the theater back in 2017 even knowing this character's name without already being familiar with the source material. But to better understand what I mean about Togusa's thematic relevance, let's watch this conversation between him and the Major from early on in the anime.
少佐、前から聞いてみたかったんだけど、なんで俺みたいな男を本庁から引き抜いたんです？
お前がそういう男だからさ。
え？
不正規活動の経験のないデカ上がりでおまけに初対持ち。電脳化はしてても脳みそはたっぷり残ってるし、ほとんど生身。
As the most human member in a team of highly cyberized operatives, Togusa fills in a potential blind spot for Section 9. Because of his lack of cybernetics and because of his background in law enforcement instead of being ex-military, he brings a different perspective to the team and adds diversity, something the Major views as a positive.
戦闘隊員としてどんなに優秀でも、 同じ企画品で構成されたシステムはどこかに致命的な欠陥を持つことになるわ。組織も人も特殊化の果てにあるのは緩やかな死。それだけ。
This even comes full circle later in the film when Togusa's experience as a detective leads him to deduce Section 6's plot to covertly steal back the Puppet Master, allowing the Major to counter their plan and set up the climax for the movie. Honestly, Togusa's character is a great example of just how different each film's perspective ends up being. Like, let's take a step back and just talk about how each film portrays technological advancements in general. In my opinion, although the filmmakers might have said otherwise in interviews, the 2017 version of Ghost in the Shell is oddly kind of technophobic. Like, let's think about the visual language of the film for a second, and specifically look at how it typically portrays cybernetic bodies. For the most part, any character who has undergone any sort of cyber enhancement is portrayed as having their humanity lessened, albeit not necessarily by the characters or the world itself, but most definitely by the camera. Whether it's the intruders in the opening action scene, random patrons at the seedy nightclub, or bothersome street peddlers, all of these people have been changed in ways that they cannot hide. They have all in some way given up part of their human form. They now have blunt pieces of metal jutting out from their bodies or exposed circuitry, and once Bato gets his distinctive robotic eyes halfway through the movie, he even makes it a point to ask the Major to feed the pack of stray dogs he's been taking care of, because now he's afraid he'll scare them off with his inhuman eyes. In essence, this is also what makes the Major so special in the world of the film. She's one of the few people who has all the advantages of cyberization, but can still pass as human, and this is hammered home even further by her counterpart, Kuze. In the final act of the film, it is revealed that Kuze was essentially a prototype for the Major, an earlier unsuccessful experiment to fully integrate a human brain with a cyborg body, and it definitely shows. He has a hobbled gait when he walks, has trouble talking without digital distortions impairing his speech, and appears to have been splicing in spare parts to repair his body over time. He is, at least according to the visual language of the film, broken, lesser, an outcast. In other words, everything that the Major is not. Which is also why it's sort of odd that the movie never really comments on this certain privilege that the Major has. While the visual iconography of the film certainly paints all these characters as part of an underclass, the actual text of the film never really does. Mostly because, well, it's just too preoccupied with the Major and her internal struggles to explore that wider view.
It's just a robot. Just a robot. Just a robot.
But on the other hand, the anime had a very different approach to all of this. While it's never really specifically commented on one way or the other, the Major is never really presented to be the first of her kind. She is a highly skilled elite operative, yes, but she's never really portrayed as a stand-in for the entirety of human evolution. Well, at least not at the beginning, that is. And the broader role of cyber-enhanced individuals in society is also very different in this version of the world as well. One of the more interesting aspects to the original Ghost in the Shell is that the line between man and machine has been blurred to such an extent that you can't really tell who has undergone what type of cyber enhancements by just looking at them. In a lot of cases, you literally have to blow them up from the inside out to see all the circuitry and metal hidden beneath the skin. In fact, the film's overall view on what makes a person is also much more complicated as well.
人間が人間であるための部品が決して少なくないように、自分が自分であるためには驚くほど多くのものが必要なのよ。それだけじゃないわ。私の電脳がアクセスできる膨大な情報やネットの広がり、それらすべてが私の一部であり、私という意識そのものを生み出し、そして同時に私をある限界に制約し続ける。
In the 95 movie, the question of what makes you, you is not just a simple Ship of Theseus dilemma. It's not asking how much of yourself can you replace with technology before you cease to be you. Instead, it believes that technology has been changing who we are since the dawn of time. Simple tools, language, the internet are all forms of technology that have altered us as a species and increased our connection to the world and each other. To phrase that another way, let me posit a philosophical question. Am I the same person when I have a calculator in my hands as I am when my hand is empty? Well, at least according to Ghost in the Shell, the answer is probably not. Well, you could consider the calculator to be nothing more than a simple tool, and certainly not a literal part of my body. Once you take it away from me, I have to switch to doing calculations entirely in my own head. I can no longer process information as efficiently as before, just like how if you took away my knowledge of how the English language works, you would be limiting my ability to converse with other people. But let's extrapolate that metaphor even further and turn the calculator into an iPhone with access to the internet. And then let's envision a future where that iPhone can be directly integrated into your own brain, and well, now you're starting to see where Ghost in the Shell is coming from. In the broadest sense, I am not the same person alone in isolation as I am when I'm connected to other individuals and their shared knowledge and history, which also harkens back to that conversation between Togusa and the Major from earlier. Adding diversity of perspective can often be beneficial, not just for the individual, but also the community they're a part of. And as our last example for this section, since we spent so much time going over how each of these films begins, well, I suppose it makes sense to go over how each of them ends as well. Now on paper, these two sections seem to be pretty comparable, because much like the first few scenes we went over, they share a lot of the same imagery. But once you start to dig a little deeper below the surface, you once again see just how hollow this adaptation really is. In the anime, while the showdown with the spider tank is certainly tense and exciting, the real meat to this finale is in the conversation between the Major and the Puppet Master that follows all the action. This is where we start to see all the themes and ideas in the film get tied together, as the Puppet Master asks the Major to merge her consciousness with theirs, essentially creating a new being. And not just in the sense that by merging, they will no longer fully be the Major or fully be the Puppet Master, but they will also be the first human consciousness to mesh with a sentient being derived solely from data. They will become the next step in human evolution, truly the first of their kind. But in the remake, this scene plays out with all the subtlety and nuance of Wile E. Coyote getting hit over the head with an anvil.
Is the spider tank within range?
Yes, sir. Awaiting your orders, sir.
I'll take control from here.
Weapons system, manual command. Spider tank now active.
The film does everything short of giving the spider tank a WWE-style entrance to let us, the audience, know that they, the filmmakers, are aware this lumbering piece of heavy machinery is a big effing deal to all the fanboys out there. And it more or less goes out of its way to retrace how exactly the action played out in the original as well, with only a few minor alterations. The Major dodges the tank's artillery by running pillar to pillar, and she uses her camouflage to finally get the jump on this mechanized behemoth. The only real difference here is that Kuze is the one who almost gets his head squished like a grape by the tank's robotic kung fu grip, and the Major is actually successful in stopping the tank on her own without the assistance of Bateau. Which, does sort of undercut the whole idea from the source material that no matter how state-of-the-art the Major's body may be, she's still not an all-powerful super being. But it's only after all the dust starts to settle that everything starts to truly go off the rails. Instead of choosing to merge with Kuze, of which the potential implications are never really discussed in the film to begin with, the Major turns down his offer and decides to stay as she is. And upon hearing this, Kuze just fades away into his network, tying up this plotline with next to no fanfare. Instead, the real denouement of the scene is Aramaki finally confronting Cutter, which puts a capper on this forced motif around the idea of consent that has come up throughout the film. I didn't really have a way to fit it into the script anywhere else, but just trust me, it's not great.
My name is Major, and I give my consent.
Finally, the film ends with a monologue by the Major telling us the thematic conclusions to everything we've just watched. Ultimately, it's our mind, and thus our soul, that gives us humanity, and that we as humans are not defined by our memories or past. Instead, it's our actions, what we decide to do with our humanity, that defines who we are as a person, something Dr. Olay told the Major back in the beginning of the film, which is ultimately why the Major decides to stay the way she is, because she's finally at peace with who she is and her place in the world. Basically, she's content with just continuing to be the raddest cyber cop in the world, I guess. In a lot of ways, the whole journey the Major goes on in this movie is pretty superfluous, assuming this isn't the first sci-fi story you've encountered that tackles these same basic ideas. We've already touched upon how the film goes out of its way from the very beginning to make you feel sympathetic towards the Major. Whether she has her memories or not, whether her body is organic or synthetic, she is clearly still a person, a being worthy of respect, and that's never really in question. Maybe it is for her as a character, but definitely not for us, the audience. Ironically, the Major starts this movie in the same place where the anime ends, as the first of her kind, albeit in a much less interesting way. The merger that happens at the end of the 95 film is quite literal, the combination of a human soul with a non-organic life form. But the merger in the adaptation is much more metaphorical, the combination of the Major's past with her current self. Each merger in their own way creates a new identity. It's just that one is a fairly insightful and timeless look at the way technology has shaped human evolution, and the other is a retread of ideas that have been thoroughly covered for centuries now. I mean, this is literal I think therefore I am kind of stuff. But as I start to put a bow on this section, I want to be sure I'm crystal clear about something here. It's easy to look at these two films and say that this adaptation is worse because of all the ways in which it is different from the original. And I do still think it's highly instructive to examine the ways in which they diverge like we just did. But I do not, by definition, have a problem with adaptations making changes to their source material. Yes, Ghost in the Shell 2017 is different, and yes, it is a bad film, but it is not bad solely because it is different. In fact, if you ask me, the main reason it's bad is because it isn't actually different enough. But to better understand what I'm talking about here, we need to take what some might describe as a meandering detour that ultimately tanks the momentum of the video. But I prefer to call it my signature style. So come along with me down the rabbit hole as we spend a few minutes talking about the inherent advantages and disadvantages of working within certain mediums. When you really get down to it, the heart of the problem we're discussing here today has everything to do with the process of adaptation, and more specifically, what does it mean to make a good or bad adaptation in the first place? Well, assuming you're adapting an already beloved property, it's tempting to say that you should try and stick as close to that original source material as possible. But what you're overlooking there is just how much changing mediums affects the story you're trying to tell. And at least in my opinion, having a firm grasp over both the strengths and weaknesses of the medium that you're working with is the single most important aspect to making a good adaptation. Now obviously, as it pertains to the two examples that we're talking about today, both live action and animation fall under the greater umbrella of what we would generally consider to be filmmaking. So there aren't a ton of foundational differences here. In other words, what we're really going to be discussing in this section is, more than anything, just a matter of tendency. Things that each medium tends to do better at, and things that they tend to struggle with. But similarities aside, there is still a sizable enough gap between live action and animation for us to make some noteworthy observations all the same. For example, because of the nature of how each medium is created, it tends to be much easier for animation to seamlessly construct stories with fantastical settings, frenetic action, and over-the-top characters. This is thanks to the fact that in its most general form, traditional 2D animation is a fairly simple process, requiring just a static background and the many celluloid drawings laid over top to create the illusion of motion. And because both elements are created by a human hand, there's a certain cohesiveness to the final product that's much harder to get within live action. In most cases, conventional filmmaking has to rely on extra special effects or CGI to achieve a similar result. And while there are certainly some exceptions, there are also many more examples where the meshing of these two components mixes together like oil and water. Now of course, making top quality animation does still require a ton of skill and practice, but outside of that, honestly the only thing limiting what you can do within this art form is really just your own imagination. But for as much as flamboyant artistry might be what the medium is most famous for, it really is the little details that truly sets it apart. Because the truth is, in animation, there's actually very little that happens by accident. Everything from the mundane objects that litter the backgrounds to the complex movements of intricate machinery had to be drawn or crafted by hand. Even something as simple as deciding when a character should blink gets considered, pored over, and planned out ahead of time. And while this kind of stuff may not be the flashiest aspect to animation, it really is the secret element that makes the wild and the bombastic feel more real to us. It's taking the time to diligently animate a bored student emptying out every bit of lead from a mechanical pencil, or showcasing the pure bewilderment slowly washing over a child's face that takes a bunch of lines and colors and turns them into a surprisingly believable, almost lifelike performance. And when I put it all like that, when I point out all the time and effort, all the exacting amount of intentionality and pre-planning that goes into creating even the simplest elements of animation, well, that all segues quite nicely into talking about one of the big strengths to live action. Because you see, while an animator might spend hours thinking about the specific ways a character might furrow their brow or curl their lips to get that exact facial expression they're trying to convey, a good actor can kind of just do that without much thought. Now again, this is another area where I don't want you to get the wrong idea. Acting, just like any other element of filmmaking, is a skill, and actors spend years and years honing their craft. But even the most meticulous performers who painstakingly scrutinize every take they give still have aspects to their performance that stem just as much from unconscious instinct as they do practiced skill. And I know this is kind of an obvious thing to point out, but another important distinction between live action and animation is that in live action, you're actually looking at a real human being. Back when we were just scrawling crude paintings on cave walls, carving figures out of marble, or painting still images onto canvas, we as a species species have been utterly obsessed with the human form, and live-action filmmaking is sort of the pinnacle of that. In essence, the purest form of photorealism. Regardless of how talented an animator is, there's just something about seeing another living, breathing person up on the screen that you can't fake within animation. There's an intrinsic authenticity to it that can't be faked, and is also why I think it's so easy for us to attach ourselves to a good performance. Which is also why when you do have live-action films with ample amounts of CGI, especially CG humanoid characters interacting with normal actors, the experience often gets broken for us. Even with the most cutting-edge technology, where artists have the benefit of a live performance for reference material, there's still just something off about these artificial characters. Lest we forget, while they may not be 2D, these are still considered to be works of animation. But alright, enough of my meandering diversions. How can we apply all of this back to our conversation about Ghost in the Shell? Well, if we break this all down and make it digestible again, on one hand we have an animated cyberpunk epic that features a ridiculously detailed world with measured and thoughtful pacing that explores the cross-section between human evolution and technology. And on the other hand, we have a live-action, big-budget sci-fi action movie with an empathetic main character going on a personal journey to discover both who she really is and what her true purpose in the world should be. So, at least on the surface, we appear to have two different stories that are pretty perfectly tailored to the two different mediums that they're in. Which also means the problems of Ghost in the Shell 2017 weren't so much from a lack of potential, but instead a failure of execution. And that, I believe, has two root causes attached to it. The first of those being poor direction. Now, I know in my last video I went on a whole tirade about how directors are far from the only creative voice that have a say in how a movie ultimately turns out, so the many shortcomings of Ghost in the Shell can't solely be laid at the feet of director Rupert Sanders. But I would still say that a lot of the failures do eventually lead back to him, because at the end of the day, a director's main job is to be an effective manager. While I think directors too often get sole credit for a film's success, there's no denying that in most cases, they are the person with by far the most individual influence over the production of a film because they're the one who has input within almost every department. So it's ultimately up to them to make sure everything about the film, from the thematic content to what the audience literally sees on screen, feels consistent. And I'm not going to sit here and pretend like that's an easy job. In fact, we can look at some of the examples we've already gone over from Ghost in the Shell to prove just that. Like take for instance the point I made earlier about how the movie depicts cybernetic bodies. Now, while from just a purely aesthetic perspective, a lot of the effects work here isn't really my jam, but there is still absolutely no denying that people put in a lot of hard work and effort making this stuff, especially with the practical effects. But if the director isn't staying in touch with the props department, then they can wind up giving you wonderfully crafted effects that still nonetheless contradict the themes of your movie. And this is kind of the big double-edged sword for working within live action. One of the great things about this kind of filmmaking is the freedom and collaboration that comes with it. For instance, the cinematographer might suggest an alternate way to light the set better, or one of the writers could suggest a change to a particular costume to better reflect the character's interiority. And while this ability to improvise and alter things in the moment can make a film better, if you don't also have someone making sure all of these changes are consistent with what the film is ultimately trying to say, well then that's how you get things like the Major being special because she's the only cybernetic character who can also pass as being human. That is, except for when she isn't. Well, for the most part, there is a pretty clean dichotomy in the film between people who have cyber enhancements and are thus disfigured and the Major. There is one character who, at first, appears to be completely human, and that's this doctor who can lift up her eyes to plug a piece of machinery directly into her eye sockets. And while this may seem like a strange inconsistency, I actually know exactly how it ended up making it into the final film. And that's because it was already in an earlier Ghost in the Shell film, specifically Ghost in the Shell 2 Innocence. And this is far from the only occurrence of this issue. For instance, let's revisit that scuba diving scene I showed you a clip from earlier. So in the anime, this is probably the single most important scene in the movie in regards to both the Major's character and the overall themes of the film, in that it's just very directly talking about these things. But when we look at this same scene in the American remake, because the film isn't focused on the same ideas, it's lost basically all of its meaning. In fact, you could cut this scene out entirely and not lose anything essential from the plot. The only thing this scene conveys to us is that the Major finds herself backed into a corner, not knowing who to trust, not even her own memories. But the thing is, we already know this. Hell, if there's one thing you can be absolutely certain that the audience is aware of by this point in the film, it's that the Major is uncertain about just how human she really is. And for our final example, I want to take us back to that climactic battle against the spider tank from the end of each film. As we already covered, the actual fight in the live-action version more or less retraces the steps of its animated predecessor. But this is another area where I think the level of detail that goes into animation really shines through, and is thus subsequently lacking in the Hollywood adaptation. For instance, take the actual setting of this fight scene. In the anime, the Major follows the Puppet Master's kidnappers to this old abandoned ferry terminal with a bunch of reliefs along the wall, and as she's running away from the tank's gunfire, we see a few of them being shot up. The final one being this depiction of the evolutionary tree of life, and stopping just short of shooting through the Latin word for man. Now, if you were paying attention at all during the last section, then it should be pretty easy to guess how this imagery might fit into the broader theme of the film. But now, let's take a look at the live-action version of this same scene. So once again, on paper, this feels like a pretty faithful reproduction. The setting isn't technically an abandoned building and is instead an open plaza in these old city ruins. But it does have this nice raised walkway which allows the filmmakers to recreate the scene of the Major running from pillar to pillar to avoid the spider tank's attacks. But again, you have to ask yourself, what is the most important aspect to that original scene? Is it the literal images themselves, or is it the reason that they're being presented to us? And this is what I meant earlier when I said animation was a medium all about the little details. Since every little nuance has to be considered, the animators will take the time to show you precisely how the metal plating of a roof bends around the Major as she lands on it, because obviously her mechanized body is going to be much heavier than the average human one. Or remember how I mentioned that even minor aspects like when a character blinks has to be given thought? Well, they specifically never show the Major blinking in the anime because, well, A, she's an android and doesn't need to, and B, it's another subtle way to make you feel uneasy about her. But in the remake, we have far too many instances of visuals and ideas being thrown together because it either just looks cool or because it's an obvious surface level callback to the immensely popular movie that came before it. And I do think the director does deserve a lot of blame for that. But as I alluded to earlier, I also think there's an additional compromising factor to all this, and that is that above all else, this film was made to be as profitable as possible. When you're critiquing any sort of adaptation, you have to stop and ask yourself, was this movie made to be good art, or was it made just to make a lot of money? And while these two philosophies aren't always directly opposed to one another, it's far more often that they compete rather than reinforce each other. Think back on all the scenes I brought up that are directly comparable to the anime. They're all the most iconic aspects to Ghost in the Shell. The opening skyscraper scene, the invisible fistfight in the reservoir, the scuba diving conversation, and the final showdown with the spider tank all make their way into the remake. But the problem is, while those all are memorable moments, none of them are actually what Ghost in the Shell is actually about, with the obvious exception of that scuba diving scene. And even then, that doesn't really matter because the Hollywood version of the film is working on such a different thematic level to begin with. Like, if they really wanted to go with a more personal, character-focused approach to the live-action Ghost in the Shell, then they actually would have been much better off adapting the first Arise OVA, because it's a slightly altered origin story for the Major where she's a less distant character and far more relatable to a general audience. But of course, they didn't do that because Arise doesn't have all the scenes that immediately come to mind when you say the words Ghost in the Shell. To put it bluntly, these scenes are why the studio bought the rights to the movie in the first place. If they wanted a looser adaptation that still covered a lot of the same themes and ideas, well then, they probably would have just financed their own original cyberpunk story instead. I mean, it certainly would have been cheaper. But the studio specifically chose to license this property because it already has a built-in audience. It has name recognition. At the end of the day, it's an investment, and a movie that will bring in those pre-existing fans is how the studio gets their return. Now, although Rupert Sanders doesn't exactly have the best track record when it comes to making good movies, I have no doubt that directing Ghost in the Shell was a difficult task. I'm sure he had plenty of executives in his ear on a daily basis making sure he was creating the kind of movie they were paying for, and that's not exactly a healthy working environment. In a lot of ways, perhaps the sign of a good director is someone who can take in all of this input, not just from their collaborators on the set, but also the many demands of the studio, and can still keep everything on track and thematically consistent. But sadly, here's the real kicker when it comes to that issue, because, well, who do you think it is that hires the director in the first place? Well, the studio, of course. So in the long run, it behooves them to hire the type of director they already know ahead of time is going to make the nice and safe, profitable movie they're looking for. And unfortunately, that's a formula that rarely produces great art. But before we wrap this whole thing up and call it a day, there is still one giant whitewashed elephant in the room that we haven't really talked about yet. And for as much as this could wind up being the most contentious section in the video, I still think this wouldn't be a complete discussion of Ghost in the Shell without it. So let's talk about Scarlett Johansson for a second. If you were at all plugged into the world of entertainment news around the time production for Ghost in the Shell was starting to ramp up, then there's a good chance you heard about the controversy around Scarlett Johansson being cast as the lead role for an adaptation of an originally Japanese film. And just in case there are any viewers out there who didn't bail after I used the word capitalism in a derogatory fashion in the intro, and are now 3 sentences deep into typing a lengthy manifesto in the comment section, let me stop you right there. Because the truth is, there was actually a point in time when I didn't really think this was a big deal either. And if you're willing to hear me out, I want to tell you what changed my mind. Now, I'm sure there's a lot of you out there who already know this, but Hollywood has been trying to do a remake of Akira for literal decades now. And I've always had this little saying that you can tell when someone got into anime based on who was rumored to be in that film at the time. For me, it was Kristen Stewart and Garrett Hedlund, which pretty easily tells you that I was getting back into anime in the early 2010s. And while most of the fanboys out there were just angry that the Twilight Girl was being cast in their anime, there were also some people who were upset that these were 2 white actors being cast in what were traditionally Japanese roles. And to be honest, I found that a little strange. For context, at the time, the thought was that the setting for the movie would be changed from Neo-Tokyo to Neo-New York, and various kinds of similar changes were going to be made to essentially westernize the Akira remake. And so from that standpoint, I didn't really understand what everyone was getting so upset about. Like, they were doing the legwork needed to adapt this story into an American setting. The characters' names would presumably be changed along with the setting, so it's not like they were trying to pass Kristen Stewart and Garrett Hedlund off as actual Japanese people. I mean, that would just be foolish. More on that in a second. But what I now realize is I had my whole thought process on this issue completely ass backwards. You see, the problem with my logic was that I was more concerned with movies doing the extra legwork to justify white actors starring in traditionally non-white roles, and not questioning why Hollywood prefers white actors in the first place. And while sadly, regardless of how woke the entertainment industry has tried to appear in the decades since that particular Akira reboot was first announced, they haven't really changed all that much. Case in point, 2017's Ghost in the Shell. Now granted, the producers of Ghost in the Shell were at least smart enough to know if they cast Scarlett Johansson as the lead of this movie to play a character named Motoko Kusanagi, then they were going to have a PR nightmare on their hands. So thankfully, they wisely tried to avoid this problem. Oh, sorry, no, they didn't do the easy thing like, just hiring a Japanese actress. No, instead what they did was change the name of the character to Major Mira Killian. Real subtle, guys, just absolutely nailed it with that one. But of course, they didn't stop at just the name change. I mean, after all, it's not the 90s anymore. Everyone knows that kind of superficial alteration isn't going to be enough to prevent people from accusing the film of whitewashing. And so this is the part of the video where if you don't already know the twist that happens at the end of Ghost in the Shell 2017, well then strap in folks, because this is some wild stuff that I'm about to hit you with here. So as we've already established, in this version of Ghost in the Shell, Major Killian, never willingly consents to being turned into an android. When she initially wakes up from her operation, we see that she has no memories of her past and is told by doctors that she was in an accident that killed both her parents and that the only way to save her was to put her brain into this state-of-the-art cybernetic body. But towards the end of the film, it's revealed that this was actually all a lie, and that she had in reality been a Japanese woman named Motoko Kusanagi who was living off the grid with an anti-augmentation activist group whose encampment had been raided by the military. So you see, it wasn't actually whitewashing because Motoko, was really a Japanese woman who just so happened to have her brain forcibly put into a new cybernetic body that coincidentally looks like Scarlett Johansson. Again, just nailed it. Ugh, I swear, even years later, I feel like I can just hear the writers patting themselves on the back for this one. But if all of this still wasn't bad enough for you, the movie ends with a scene of Major Mira Motoko whoever reuniting with her biological mother, who is actually played by a Japanese actress, and as the two share a loving embrace, this is the point of the movie where my skin just wants to crawl off of my body and go die in a hole in the woods somewhere. But okay, we haven't really talked about why this is all bad yet. So what you're really saying to Japanese people when you cast Scarlett Johansson as the Major is, we think these stories and franchises that originate from Japan and have resonated with audiences across the world despite it not being from their native culture is what makes this project worth pursuing. But to make sure the film is the most profitable that it can be, we need to throw some white people in there too, which is a bit of a contradiction in and of itself. Really, when you stop to think about it, Hollywood's problem with representation stems from the same root cause as all the other issues we've been talking about in this video. Money. Or at least the perceived notion of money, that is. You see, this isn't really about Scarlett Johansson being the best actor for the role. I mean, she's fine in the movie, I guess, but as we've already gone over, it's a pretty standard hero's journey kind of performance. Plenty of actors could have done an equally serviceable job here, even someone who is, I don't know, Japanese. But no, the real reason we need Scarlett Johansson in this movie is the same reason Ghost in the Shell is getting adapted in the first place. She's got name recognition. She's been in like a dozen Marvel films at this point, which have raked in boatloads of cash both domestic and abroad, and that is something that not just anyone has. So you see, we'd love to hire a Japanese actress, but the problem is there just aren't any of them out there who have that same kind of star power when we put their name above the title on the poster. Which brings us to the much more fundamentally flawed logic to the notion that, on average, white actors have more pull at the box office than marginalized actors do. Because, well, no shit. I mean, it's pretty hard to become a household name when they won't cast you in any big budget movies to begin with. That, my friends, is a little thing we in the biz like to call a self-fulfilling prophecy. Oh, and it's just one final little piece of irony here. Ghost in the Shell still bombed even with Scarlett Johansson in it. And look, technically speaking, there's a whole separate discussion to be had about moving this particular argument outside of the realm of profitability. Like, if the whole underlying issue to all these problems we've gone over today is the need to produce revenue, then in the long run, it probably doesn't make a lot of sense for us to be making the argument that marginalized actors can make the studio just as much money as white actors do. But I mean, that would require a pretty in-depth conversation of its own, and this video is already running really long here. So instead, I'll just finish up by saying, if for the time being we truly are stuck operating within the current Hollywood system, then is it really so much to ask for non-white actors to get their shot at a starring role when the film we're adapting already originates from a non-white culture? Like if Ghost in the Shell, a story that is literally about how diversity is a fundamental aspect to human evolution, can't survive with a Japanese actress being in the lead role, then like, folks, what are we even doing here? I know there are some viewers out there who might not believe me when I say this, but I honestly don't start out every video with the intention of critiquing capitalism. Originally, this whole thing was just supposed to be a fun little look at a bunch of different live-action anime adaptations to see what they all had in common and what made the few rare good ones stand out. But as I got further and further into that first draft, I started to notice I was kind of repeating myself quite a bit. Because as it turns out, a lot of those films all had the exact same problems. At the end of the day, what goes wrong when anime goes Hollywood is the same thing that goes wrong when any piece of art is made for profit first and quality second. So basically, I just don't really know how I could have adequately talked about the many failures from this version of Ghost in the Shell without also bringing up the demands of capitalism as well. On top of all that, I also just generally don't like making videos about stuff that I dislike. But that's also why secretly, one of the things I like the most about this video is that it actually helped me appreciate the original Ghost in the Shell even more. In all honesty, before I started working on this project, I was pretty lukewarm on Ghost in the Shell as a whole. It was a film that I had seen a couple of times, and from a historical perspective, I certainly understood its importance. But it was just never really a movie that resonated with me all that much. But that all changed once I forced myself to start thinking about why I thought the remake was so much worse. And look, anime is only continuing to get more and more popular, so this is far from the last time we'll be having this kind of discussion. Hell, I might very well be dead and buried by the time they finally do it, but eventually, someone is going to get that remake of Akira across the finish line. And when they do, there's two things that I want you to remember. First off, it doesn't have to be another mediocre adaptation. But if it doesn't learn at least a few of these lessons from Ghost in the Shell, then it probably will be. But secondly, and perhaps more importantly, no matter how bad a remake is, there's nothing it can do to ever take the original away from us. In fact, it might even make you appreciate the original film more than you ever did before. And you know what? For the time being, I think I can live with that.